You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello, my name is Derek McNeil, and I'm the academic dean here at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. And this is our program podcast called Text, Soul, and Culture. And with me today is Dr. Stephanie Neill, who is Associate Professor of Counseling Psychology. Welcome.
Thank you.
I've already prepped Stephanie to think a little bit about how she became a psychologist and what led her to become a psychologist, and secondarily, how she got here. This school invested in integration.
Well, it was a meandering path to becoming a psychologist. I tried not to be one. My family valued education, so we were all going to go to college for sure. But the deal was you go to college for 4 years and then you're done. So took a psychology class in high school, and psychology and literature were the two classes I loved the most in high school. But I thought, well, that's not practical. So either of those. So it made perfect sense to go into business or not.
I tried that. It didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work for me either. I did try. And my first quarter of my third year, I decided I would do organizational behavior because at least that would have a bit of the psychology piece. But I was so in the wrong place that I actually quit college. Probably scared my parents. I think I did. I told them if I don't quit now, I'd probably never finish because I can't do this. I can't see myself doing this. So I took some time off from schooling and did some reading. And I talked to some people that others introduced me to. One was a psychologist at the church I was going to, who had gone to Rosemead School of Psychology. And he said, I think what you're really wrestling with and talking about, thinking about doing would be a really good fit for this program. I also interviewed people who had master's degree in social work and master's in counseling, and I decided, well, I think I want to get a doctorate because I think I want that kind of training to do that kind of work. Clinical work, I was thinking. I wasn't thinking of teaching. So I finished my Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and then I went on to Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University because at that time, so this was in the early 80s, there were two programs that had an integrative component, and as you know, one was Fuller and the other was Rosemead. And I think I just was taken with the more psychodynamic approach that Rosemead had psychologically, and a strong privileging of relationship. Both in the way they taught and structured their program, but also the content. So that's where I ended up.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't know, for whatever reason, I don't think I knew the literature interest, which I'll see if it comes together in terms of the psychology, the narrative story interest. But I was curious, you said I was not thinking about teaching, but I was probably focused on the clinical work. What about the clinical work captured your imagination?
Yeah. Well, I don't think I would have put it in these words at the time back then, but right now it would be listening carefully to narrative and wanting to help, wanting to somehow contribute, and this is probably true for most people who enter the field, but you know, I was the person in my family and in my circle of friends that people came to talk to. So something, you know, in me, I think was born a listener. And, you know, that's that narrative thread was probably what I loved about literature too. You know, what's the story? Why do the characters do what they do? And you know, what creates change? How come there's this outcome for this character and this outcome for that character? And can you influence that or not?
I realized it's interesting. I'm very similar. I thought I was going to try to be a business major. It didn't work, and for the same reason, I kept thinking, I can't do anything with psychology, but unless you go on.
Right.
And so I'll be a business major. That didn't really work. And I just enjoyed people a whole lot more. And I think for me, different than narrative, it was people were puzzles. On some level, I was still trying to figure them out. And but also that same sort of role of being the person who people ask questions of and the family fixer.
Right.
Kind of pulled into that role a bit. And so probably came in similar sort of urges that psychology would give me more tools. Yeah.
Well, and I think we're always trying to figure ourselves out too, right?
Yes, we are. Yeah. No. Lovely. What led you here? This school? The teaching. How did teaching come up? Get louder for you?
So I came to the Northwest to do my internship at the VA in Tacoma. And as soon as I finished that, I started in a group private practice and kind of was just happily doing that. And a friend of mine was connected with SPU, and he said, hey, we've got this grant and we want to bring in some outside clinicians to do this supervision. We've never done it before. We're just going to do it this year. So would you be willing to do that? I'm like, sure. You know, I'd been in practice then for maybe, 5 or 6 years. And I thought, I'm ready for something different. Yeah. So I did that. And one of the students in my group was one of the founders of the school, Kirk Webb. And he said, hey, I'm working in this kind of startup graduate school, and have you heard of Dan Allender's work? And I said, no. And so he sent me a book and said, would you be interested in maybe doing some work with us? And I said, well, I don't know. Let me see what you guys are doing. So I went to a seminar that Dan was doing in the area, and that was my first introduction to kind of his way of thinking, and read his book, The Wounded Heart, which my training had been in object relations, psychoanalytic, and he wasn't using any of those terms, but reading between the lines, I think there was a lot of both integrative work and kind of object relations thinking in that book and in what I heard him doing at the seminar. So I got on board. And that was in 2001.
And your role has then grown because, you were...
Yeah, I started just leading practicum groups, and I think just one for a couple of years. And then my son, who at the time was in kindergarten, I think the first year that I worked here. So when he got into elementary school, I took on a little bit more and then started teaching a couple years after that. Ethics.
And he's how old now?
He is 21.
So you have really been dancing with the school a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The integration part, again, I hear in some of the language of the school or language of Dan, some things that felt familiar or that you could see that drew you in terms of psychoanalytic thinking. And I'm curious about the integrative part, because it's a little bit different than most places. What about the integrative part is either interesting or actually challenging, either of those pieces?
Yeah, I think that was definitely a big draw, to be in a community that was doing thinking and talking, dialoguing about both theology and psychology, and the ways in which those speak to human development. And I think, I'd been introduced to guess I'll call it biblical counseling, which didn't feel, at least the version of it that I first encountered, didn't feel very psychologically sound. Let's slap some verses on the problem and pray and it should go away. Well, that doesn't really work. So I think there's something about the depth of really wanting to understand who we are as human persons, both spiritually and psychologically. Not that we can slice it up, into those neat categories, but I think we all do have a theology that we live by and are formed psychologically in relationship.
Well, it's interesting. Maybe this is me tying literature. I wouldn't say I grew up loving literature, but I enjoyed the drama of the story. And so it feels like the way you talk about integration, it's more whole than just superficial. In other words, it gets into the depth of the character, if you will, gets into the depth of the conflict or the drama, and a chance to see more deeply in people's stories and narrative than just simply the Band-Aid or a quick fix. And so I like that piece of depth. What's been the challenging part about that here in terms of doing integration or thinking integratively?
Well, a couple things come to mind. One, there's never enough time
Yeah.
to do all the reading and thinking that you, and have conversations that you want to have, right? And I think part of it too is divisions within fields. So when you're talking about theology, what theology are you talking about? And when you're talking about psychology, what psychology are you talking about? And, the theology and psychology have different languages, but within those there are different languages, which makes movement toward understanding challenging at times.
I agree. I mean, that's one of the things until I got here, and we had theologians sitting with psychologists and actually having some of these conversations, it really was using theological metaphor with a lot of psychological sort of understanding. And the conversation of I'm a systematic theologian versus a biblical theologian versus a practical theologian just wasn't relevant in my head, sitting with psychologists. Or, we would certainly be talking about our frames, whether you're psychoanalytic or cognitive behavioral or neuroscience oriented. And we would have those sort of conversations, or experimental, but we didn't actually recognize that across the discipline, was I talking to a systematic theologian, or was I talking to a biblical theologian? And that mattered. And so that is something that probably even for me, sitting in conversations of integration wasn't highlighted. And we weren't really trying to have conversations with theologians per se. We really were trying to have conversations with psychologists who were thinking theologically.
Right.
And that's been an interesting both blessing and challenge here. We have folks sitting next to us, working beside us, who are of a different discipline. And finding common language can sometimes be difficult, even identifying what particular aspect of theology you're engaged in. But I've appreciated the complexity of that. It's made the conversations harder. But when we get to them, richer in some sort of way. And that's been an interesting... And again, for I don't know how many years, 15 years of looking at integration, 20 years actually, and not making that distinction when we did integration. And acting as if theology was really a subdivision of a type of psychology in the integrative process. And that's been different here. That's been different here. Yeah. What do you enjoy about your students? Again, you'd mentioned that you've kept growing into this teacher role and teacher identity. And I have to assume that something about that drew you in terms of working with students. And what are the rewarding experiences you have with students?
Yeah. It's kind of like being a mother in some ways, where you get to be a part of forming, in the educational realm, forming a practitioner, and which requires investment, but there's also a lot of payoff from that. And for instance, we're kind of right in the middle of teaching ethics right now. And we really approach that in a very personal, embodied way, and with the acknowledgement that when we make ethical decisions, they're usually made very quickly, in the moment, on the spot, and then we think about them later. And so who we are has such a bearing on the decisions that we make. And I can think about that with a 21-year-old child of mine, young man of mine now, but also with students that it's just very rewarding and exciting to be having a part in forming the way that they be in the world and in the work. It also keeps me learning a lot. I mean, I learned so much from them, and I learned so much from preparing to teach. And also, I think in our culture, in our school, in our environment, you really have to show up with your whole self, whether you're faculty, staff, or student. And I think when a lot is required of us, the payoff is a lot. When I was finishing my undergrad degree, I was taking anatomy and physiology, and it was so difficult. And I remember talking to my dad one time saying, I don't know if I can get this done. I mean, I'm overwhelmed. And he said, well, nothing worth having in life comes easy. If it's really worth it, you're going to have to work hard. And I'm like, okay.
I used to hate that speech, but it's just so true.
It is so true.
It's so true.
Yeah.
I think for me as the dean, I do recognize how much you all extend yourselves beyond just giving them information. That there really is a bit of a life part of your life invested in it. And as we sit with students and talk with them, I know we're doing more than just simply giving them good ideas. That we really are asking them, who are you in the space? How do you bring yourself, your presence? How are you embodied in those spaces?
Right.
And that does take a lot. I do occasionally have concerns about how much we ask of you. There is a lot we ask of you, and I do think there's a very valuable payoff. But it's an investment.
Yeah.
It's more than just simply showing up and teaching some concepts and moving on.
Yeah.
I did a forum with students, and actually more than a few students were loving one of the classes you teach, Interpersonal Neurobiology. And one student, she said very clearly and plainly, you have to make this a required course because everything makes sense to me now. I don't even know what the everything makes sense was, but everything makes sense to her. Somehow the paradigm had shifted and she made sense. And I'd love to hear a little bit about interpersonal neurobiology. And if you have any idea what they're talking about, but the sense that, I think it was something to do with it was an integrative conversation they were saying. The sense that things were maybe fragmented before, but somehow some of the things being taught in that class brought things together. And the sense of body, mind, and relationships. Those three things came together. So I'd love to hear how you think about that class and what you teach and
Okay.
what they may be thrilled about. Yeah.
Yeah. So the subtitle of that class is Nurturing Relationships with the Brain in Mind. And each piece of that is important. So we're looking at the brain, but talking about the mind, and I use Dan Siegel's definition of the mind as an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And I mean, that's a pretty integrative definition right there.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So that class, looking at neuroscience and neurobiology, but particularly as it illuminates both how we develop as human beings in the context of close relationship, the mother-infant relationship initially, an attachment relationship, and then how we can heal, again, in the context of relationship, and really paying attention to what the new neuroscience research can tell us and show us about particular structures in the brain and mind and body that contribute to that, but how to pay close attention to things that maybe unconsciously, intuitively, we have already been doing, but we can tune into them and pay even closer, more careful attention. And I think that has put some, structure or legs on what often students find undefined in things like practicum or, therapy 1 and 2. So they know that there's this relational piece that has a huge impact. But I've tried in that class to really say, okay, here's what it is. This is part of what's happening. And then there's some interesting research around brains of folks who have, for instance, Buddhist monks who've meditated most of their lives, or Catholic nuns who've been in a particular kind of prayer for most of their lives, and what do their brains look like when they are in prayer or in meditation. And so kind of taking a look at God in the brain as well, which leads us into discussions around faith and belief, but also wisdom. And I think one of the things that's exciting for me about that class is I've always loved science. I struggled with anatomy and physiology, but I have always loved science. In fact, I remember one of the highlight gifts of my young life was I got a microscope for Christmas one year, and I just loved looking at things in that microscope. So that sense of the excitement of discovery that I think you get in science, but also I think the more I know about human being, the more my faith actually grows. And science does that for me. So I don't know if that's some of what students have caught in that class or not, but it's exciting for me.
Well, I've got biologists. Well, this is the anatomy piece, so it's still something about discovery. But I love this. I mean, I love this piece about the mind, the brain, and relationships, because that's bridging a link that sometimes we have trouble bridging. And it's brain and mind, however you engage that. And this was a very biological piece. But then you move into the sort of social aspects of our being, which is the relationships, the sort of forming and shaping, that we're not just simply driven by genes, but the interaction of our physicalness and our socialness interact. And then the thing you're hinting at is a spirituality in that. That even for you, that even science, to looking at the biology and the relationship, produces a sense of appreciation and gratitude for a spirituality, if you will, or something that transcends.
Yeah.
A quality of transcendent. I can see where they would enjoy it. Yeah, it was quite funny because I had as many students as I typically have ever about this class, and I do hear the integrative quality of it and spiritual quality of it, but it doesn't leave out the body nor the brain.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we will talk about spirituality, and I can't tell where the body is, or I can't tell even where the brain is. I can hear the mind, but I can't quite hear the brain, and I can't hear how these things go together. And so it sounds like this is a unique set of things coming together. As a teacher, as a clinician, as a mother, what do you dream? What do you, for your students? Maybe even I'll leave it open to kind of let you see where that takes you. What do you dream? What do you hope for in terms of school or in terms of life, your career? What do you dream?
That's a big question. Well, the first word that comes to mind just immediately is wholeness. And something you said earlier in our conversation about integration made me think of the word integer, which is a whole number, and integrity, and the relationship of wholeness and integrity, and integration. And Tom Johnson, who was our interim dean before you came, he had a definition of salvation that I've always loved, which he said was God's fierce determination to set all things right. And so I think of wholeness with that what am I doing in my realms, whether that's my family, as a mother, as a teacher, as a therapist, to bring wholeness or salvation, in Tom's definition, that's setting things right. To be moving things in a positive direction, even if it's just one increment in one relationship.
I like that. It's interesting as you came back to the word integration or wholeness, which is a bit more than putting things together. And I think I have probably thought about integration as putting things together, which doesn't suggest it has to be whole. Wholeness is a qualitatively different attempt than just sticking things together. And I'm making it pejorative now, sticking things together. But I think the sense of wanting wholeness as an integrative goal for life, not just in terms of my thinking or disciplines, feels like a deeply rich venture, and qualitatively more than putting ideas together. I like that. I mean, I appreciate that. I think, we can sometimes focus a lot on what sort of piece did you write, or what sort of concept did you put together, or what sort of language pieces. Well, this is different. This is embodied. It's also spiritual, because the notion of putting something right is righteousness. And the sense that maybe even implied is something out of our control to fully bring them together, but the sense that wholeness is holding, coming together, bridging, not just sticking together for the sake of we did it. I like that.
Yeah, which includes our brokenness, right, and our wounding, and to some degree we're all in this work because of our particular woundedness. and a desire to work with that and help others work with that. And I think that is part of wholeness, is not getting over that or leaving that out, but how do we include and embody that and our vulnerability and our ongoing vulnerability.
That's good. Well, I think ongoing vulnerability is a good note to end our conversation. Lovely. And thank you.
Thank you.
Very appreciate we haven't had a chance to sit down and actually talk about some of these things, and I won't forget the definition, the sense of wholeness. It's actually shifted my view of what integration's about. Yeah. Because I have always spent a lot of time thinking, how do these things go together? Almost again going back to that puzzle piece, that sense that I like puzzles. And it's been how do puzzle pieces fit together?
Right.
Or how do you help fit them together? Which is very different qualitatively than pursuing wholeness, which means some things you have to let come together. You may situate them in certain ways, but then there is a sort of release to it, or what's emergent of that. And so I like that. That's shifting my thinking.
That's reminding me of the faculty retreat where you had us do a puzzle,
yes,
and you kept some of the pieces, so we actually couldn't complete it.
Yes, so clearly I like puzzles and pieces, and but it's a maybe an overused metaphor for me, because it's like, wow, because that's the whole point,
right?
Is the wholeness, and you can actually see wholeness even when all the pieces aren't on the board.
Exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't require everything to be set in place for them to have a sense of gestalt.
Yes.
Yeah. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's been great to sit down and chat with you. And
thank you.
Thank you for sharing with our audience and being you.
I've enjoyed the conversation.
Good.
Thank you.